This is episode 4 of Quarantine Talk. It's a show where people around the world comes together to discuss the latest of world developments. This week, our topic is climate change, featuring speakers from India, UK, Spain, and Taiwan. The following show is recorded on 19th of April, 2020. Enjoy! Welcome everybody. I'm your host, Jerry Chen. I'm calling live from Taipei, Taiwan. And do you guys want to introduce yourself as well? Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex, and I'll be the co-host, and I'm here in Madrid, Spain.
Claire?
My name's Clare Andrews. I'm in Newcastle in the UK. And I'm involved with environmental activism.
Ishan?
Hi, I'm happy to be part of this podcast today. I'm in India right now and looking forward to having a conversation around COVID and climate change.
For today's show, our topic will be about environment and climate change. First, Alex and I will go through news brief of the latest news from the past week, and then we will launch into a discussion about climate change, environmental, and sort of the world we want to see post COVID-19, environmental wise. So the first news of the week, of course, on everybody's mind is the COVID-19 cases. So according to the data released by WHO, the total case of COVID-19 cases are currently stand 2,203,927 cases, with confirmed death over 148,749 deaths, over 213 countries and areas all over the globe. And that's the latest numbers from WHO. People has been contesting about WHO on their authority, but so far they has been the most foremost authority on calculating data and sort of having an overview on this. How about you, Alex? What other news do we have today?
Well, I have a bit of a light-hearted news. This one is kind of funny but unsettling. Well, on Friday, the 17th, in Cambridge, it was seen like a UFO-shaped object flying around the county for 20 minutes before falling down on a mass of fire. They don't know what it is. They have not released any official statements describing the object. From the photos that I've seen, and we'll try to insert one here or wherever we can in the video. It looks like that straight of like smoke that airplanes leave, but it doesn't look like a plane or a helicopter. To me, it looks more as if a part of the satellite has fallen down. So I don't know, but that doesn't explain it circling around for 20 minutes. So it's funny.
On other news of the pandemic, China on Friday has raised its coronavirus death toll by 50% in Wuhan amid the accusations that the government has concealed the extent of the epidemic. Officials placed the new tally at 3,869 deaths from the coronavirus in the central Chinese city, an increase of 1,290 from the previous figure. The number of cumulative confirmed infections in the city was also revised upwards to 5,333, an increase of 325. And that's the latest news on China's numbers. And how about the flip side of it in USA? What do you have for us, Alex?
This one's kind of unsettling as well. In the past week, there's been a number of protests all throughout the US, starting in Michigan. A lot of people went out in their cars mainly, which good because social distancing, to the capital of Michigan, blocking the main road, which was a great issue. And some medics, some nurses were in the cars trying to get to their hospitals, and they couldn't get to the places of work because of the traffic jam that it was formed. but not everyone were staying in their cars, and some people were actually going out without masks, without gloves, without protection of any kind, and going to the capital to just protest. And the reasoning behind this is apparently because they are against the lockdown and the self-isolation and the measures that have been put on place to prevent the further, spread of the disease. But yeah, it's been escalating, and more states like Texas have been, these protests have been seen all around the country. So it's going to be interesting how that moves on.
In some news, our guests may be interested in this, since both of you guys are activists. And so, according to the newest report from the BBC, in Nigeria, security forces enforcing the lockdown in parts of Nigeria has killed more people than the coronavirus itself. A local rights group says. The National Human Rights Commission says law enforcement have killed 18 people in Nigeria since the lockdown began on 30th of March, whereas the coronavirus has killed 12. The issue of police brutality has been a major concern of the nation even before the pandemic, as it estimates 1,476 people were killed by state actors in the country over the past year, says the Council on Foreign Relations. So obviously, this issue of police brutality has become even more of a foremost concern, especially amidst a pandemic. Authorities are given more power. So what do you guys think about the rise in police's power, authority all over the globe? Are you guys concerned about it? What could we do to reasonably protest against these kind of overusing of power, like when there's a lockdown going on in multiple countries around the world? Claire?
Well, obviously, I'm never really a fan of disproportionate state violence. That's a problem in a lot of countries, and probably becoming worse as you give police more powers. I mean, here in the UK, our police have been granted more temporary powers. And I think, at the moment, as far as I've seen, that's being used appropriately. But I guess one of my fears is that once lockdown ends and once hopefully this crisis is over, whether those powers will then be reversed. And I think, across the world, that's a real issue, that if police are being given extra powers and there's extra social control, that is proportionate to the crisis and is reversed again after this is over, hopefully soon.
What about you, Ishan? What are your concerns about
Yeah.
police brutality?
So I think one of the kind of the preliminary fallouts of the COVID response has been that authoritarian states, where you have more power to the government and police, they have actually been more successful in curtailing cases and deaths, and really being able to zone in and do testing and tracing. So in this environment where every country is trying its maximum now to protect its citizens, it feels like the authoritarianism in a way, which apparently polarizes people and puts the state machinery really directly on top of the population, would become kind of the go-to strategy for a lot of struggling states. So that is a great danger, especially in like a continent like Africa has still not been affected hugely, but it is projected to be in the coming months. And authoritarianism there, and even parts of Asia already, I think is a matter of great concern, because already the rights for activists and civil liberties were being cracked down on for the past few years here. So it's kind of ironic, but again, these are preliminary stages, and maybe long-term response to COVID would not be about how authoritarian a state can be, but how cooperative and kind of compassionate can be towards citizens.
Mm-hmm. Of course. So for you, Alex, what other news do we have around the globe today?
Before that, I would also like to add that it was announced the other day that the second, the right-hand man of the Nigerian president passed away due to coronavirus. So I think that's also going to have an impact on how police work, how the government maybe implement some policies or not, and how the the citizens behave, because it's very different to have. I think the UK must have seen this as well when Boris Johnson was taken to the hospital. I think it's very different when suddenly you see someone in a powerful position that it's been taken care of, because of course they're gonna be like maximum priority. Suddenly they fell sick and died due to this. So I also think that's gonna be interesting. But other than that, and I think you guys are also gonna like this piece of news, or not, depending on how you see it. But for now, the airlines have seen a 96% drop on their passengers and the amount of people that fly. And this is like the lowest rate of passengers since the 50s. For now, the airlines in the airline industry is 2% of the global emissions of carbon of pollution. So a lot of airlines, what they're doing, it's flying empty planes because they still have to consume the oil that they have bought, because otherwise it's a huge loss for the company. So I would like to ask you, what is your take on the airline policies? And of course, taking into account a lot of them are going filing for bankruptcy and still having to maintain their company afloat, which it gives jobs to a huge amount of people. Whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
Claire, do you want to go?
You first this time.
Okay, I think, yeah, airline bailouts is definitely going to, I think, be in our news a lot in the next 6 months, because most of these airline companies weren't profitable, and with this, huge dip in flying passengers and all kinds of disruptions to the businesses. It is, I think, a catch-22 situation. I obviously don't fly, and I feel that public transport has to be supported in terms of more railways and buses. But at the same time, especially in the global south, especially in the underdeveloped nations, in a way, I think reinforcing airlines is I think necessary in a way, because a lot of businesses, a lot of local measures are dependent on that. And I mean, personally, I feel the government needs to prioritize citizens, needs to prioritize their safety, need to prioritize their health before they ever think about pulling up these airline companies. Maybe this will herald in a way for companies to consolidate rather than have like 7 or 8 airline companies, and each one of them having their competitive price wars and all. Maybe that realignment can help. But yeah, I think this is something that we'll have to see how it plays out. But definitely, the government should not prioritize this. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm going to agree with a lot of that. I am really sad for people who individually are, their jobs are at stake. And I mean, one thing I would really like to see is, the government focus on those people and offering them payments and retraining and help into different industries. One thing I'd like to see is a universal basic income, which has been tried in several countries, and that would at least stop people who are, losing their work, falling into kind of poverty traps and, the direst of things happening to them. But yeah, I don't want to see governments bail out polluting industries like, airlines and fossil fuel companies, like happened after the last big financial crash. I want to see them focus on, as Ishan says, like individual people, local businesses, and greener businesses, not the ones that are actually causing us damage and can increase the frequency of disease outbreaks in the future.
Do you think how this is affecting the airline companies might push them to use other types of fuels, other types of techniques that might be a little bit more greener?
I mean, I don't know if fuel is the limiting factor on airlines at the moment. And I mean, I'm no kind of market analyst, but people seem to have conflicting views about whether after this, there's going to be a flood of the market of kind of cheap fossil fuels, which will actually push things in the opposite direction and I think that's something we've got to be very careful of. Governments have to be very careful doesn't happen.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you so much, Ishan. So now we will sort of, you guys we have been talking for almost 5 minutes, but I don't think the audience has understood who you guys are, and I want you guys to sort of introduce who you are, and so maybe at this time I'll let Ishan go first. Ishan, can I ask? You are a part of the Extinction Rebellion India, is that correct?
Yeah.
Could you tell us what do you do in Extinction Rebellion? What part do you participate in?
Yeah. So I've been part of the Extinction Rebellion in India for 10 months now, and originally it began with a group of us from different parts of India, some in Delhi, some in Mumbai, some in Bangalore, thinking about how to kind of align with this global movement and begin a grassroots climate activist movement. I was based in Bangalore then, and since then, for about 3-4 months, we've uh, last year done a lot of climate strikes in coordination with the global movement. We've tried to mobilize local citizens on on issues that have been plaguing basically the city of Bangalore, like our lakes, cutting down of trees, industrial pollution, etc. So I've been co-facilitating that. Apart from that, I've been kind of helping with the strategy for XR India, and most recently I've been part of the XR scientist group, which is uh, so there's a lot of different working circles between in the XR scientist group, but I am looking at science messaging. So yeah, ultimately a lot of different hats within the movement.
You mentioned before to us last time we have our pre-meeting about you're in a community that is both self-sufficient and localized. Could you expand how that works? What you're currently doing?
Yeah, yeah. So for the past couple of months, I've been staying in this small international township in South India. It's called Orwell, and I've been in and out of this place for the last 3 years. But as part of, I think, my almost activist slash activist journey, kind of, I've been looking at how local solutions can be embedded into a lot of top-down thinking. And while a lot of activist movements talk for systemic shifts in terms of moving up to fossil fuels and more focus on clean energy and things of those sorts. We also need kind of blueprints and models of how self-sufficient regenerative communities work. So Orwell is one such experiment that's actually been here for the last 50 years. So in that sense, it's been here for a bit of time, and about 3,000 people from 60 plus nationalities live here. So me personally being here, I've been involved in some local projects. I stay near a farm. I grow some food, eat that local food. And for me, this COVID crisis has come at a time where it has reinforced a lot of kind of beliefs of mine, where we have to cut down our supply chains, we have to grow more food, make sure that our communities are more self-resilient and self-reliant, and you know even in terms of respond to this kind of global crisis which has affected people locally everywhere. This community has been really fluid and very calmly responded to it. Like, even though we are in line with the shutdown that's happened across India, here it's within the community. It's still well done, in the sense people are not panic buying, or people aren't getting into a mode of okay, this is doomsday and I'm feeling lonely or not healthy. I think the community is there to support each other. So yeah, last month and a half has been super interesting, being stuck here of all places in India, because the response and the environment is different.
The self-sufficient community you're in, what do you think? How could people sort of apply the lessons you learn from helping these communities? How could other communities benefit from these systems, and how would they do that?
So I think two main pillars are probably energy reliance and energy self-reliance and food systems. So this community too, as much as possible, we use solar energy, especially in the place where I live. Parts of the community, some are taking from thermal power plants. But in essence, any such community would have to devise a way of making sure they can move to clean energy, growing your own food, but also constructing buildings which are kind of sustainable with the soil. So I think these two are main things, and as much as possible conserving water. This region actually is kind of suffering with water shortage. It's projected in India this year and the next. Droughts will happen a lot, and I think mega droughts and droughts globally are something that is projected largely. So yeah, water conservation is probably the third most important thing.
Do you think that could be translated to maybe bigger communities? Because I don't know how big the place you're living at is, but do you think maybe if other cities or bigger towns try to do this, how feasible that would be?
I think it is definitely possible. But when we talk about cities or bigger places, then I think the decisions from the top have to trickle down to the bottom in a very kind of smart way. There is need for some kind of decentralization in terms of how communities live. Like everybody can't be told that you have to live only on clean energy, or you have to make sure that water is conserved, or you have to make sure that food is grown on a farm. Some people will not, agree, or some people want their comfort. So in that sense, there is that, kind of balance. And that is, even though populations are getting concentrated in cities, we would say that cities have to be decluttered and people have to spread out more, and cities cannot be our future. In that sense, I think decentralization is key. If top-down structures are going to, kind of take this blueprint and apply such models elsewhere, yeah, I think it's a Herculean task. Groups of small people like that, 3,000 people doing it here, it's a lot easier.
Obviously, of course. So for you, Claire, how are you coping with the lockdown?
Well, I think I'm in a lot of ways one of the lucky ones. I have a safe place to live. I'm getting food. In the UK, unless you have particular, high risk group or particular health issues, we're still allowed to go outside and take exercise. And I'm really lucky that I live right next to, I'm in the city, but I live near a nice little park and a little wood. So I get to go and enjoy nature when I'm doing my exercise every day. So so far so good. And the community that I live in, which is not an intentional sustainable community at all, but there's a lot of good neighbours around, and they're kind of looking out for each other, and we're forming a bit of a community group to try and take care of the people who can't get out. So it's mostly positive, but in the circumstances.
It's good news to hear. But so you have a PhD on animal behavior science, is that right?
I do, yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about what that is and how does that relate to your fight for environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think both my interest in animal behaviour and my interest in environment, they come from the same place within me. Ever since I was a small child, I've always been very interested in nature and the environment, and I was one of those kids who used to play with worms and things. So if anyone's doing homeschooling, I totally recommend setting up a wormery. Yeah, so I mean, my work at the moment as a scientist isn't directly related to the environment, but I work with some psychologists as well, and we look at how poverty and how not having reliable access to food actually changes people's behavior and their psychology and their reactions to stress later on in their lives. And I actually look at these questions in birds as well as a kind of model of humans. And I guess that relates to some of the things I'm thinking about in terms of environmental problems to do with having reliable food supplies and trying to address some of the social justice issues about poverty, because I really see the effects. And I suppose also being a scientist, it's very clear to me, that the science about climate change, climate breakdown is really, really clear. And I see the writing on the wall there, perhaps where some other people who haven't studied science don't quite, see the urgency of that. So yeah, they do relate.
So part one of the news we mentioned in our news brief was the sort of civil unrest. Do you think in some regions or some countries, the civil unrest is related to the lack of resources, the sort of the poverty situation you mentioned in your studies?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I know that in some countries where, say for example Brazil, where people are very much reliant on kind of self-organizing, small scale economy, as soon as you're in lockdown and if there's no welfare state, there's no benefit system to look after people are literally worried about where they're going to get any money or food from, and I think that contributes in some countries to unrest. I guess the situation in America is quite different, and yeah, I'm not sure what to comment on what might be the psychological causes of that one, but yeah.
So,
Trump supporters.
so, but can you tell us more about your activism in environment?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been doing things on a lot of levels. So I'm also a supporter of Extinction Rebellion in the UK, and very much support the work of Extinction Rebellion scientists. And yeah, so I've done some kind of public outreach, trying to talk to normal members of the public about the environment and climate change and what we might need to do, and looking at their ideas as well about actually people I think know a lot more and are much more concerned than we might be led to believe by our governments here. And yeah, I've been involved in some of the UK protests, trying to get our government to take this issue seriously, as seriously as they are the current corona crisis, at least. And yeah, I'm also involved with the Green Party in the UK, so I'm trying to particularly in local politics, I've been involved there trying to get our local government to take more action on climate change and other environmental issues that really affect our health, and on social justice as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, guys. So now we will sort of go into some discussions about environment. So hope the audience have the sense of what you guys do and your background. And back to Alex. So what's our first topic?
So don't be afraid to jump in and say whatever you want to say. But I wanted to go back a few months to January, when the doomsday clock actually moved, and it's now 100 seconds to midnight, which means that's when everything's supposed to implode. It's very bad if we get to midnight, basically. The main reason behind this that was given was the climate change and the problems around the environment and pollution, basically because of the human, human done things, basically. So I just wanted to ask if you think the coronavirus, recession of the pollution and the whole reduction of the CO2, if you think that will maintain or that will help the clock go back a little bit, or it won't?
I guess the main thing I want to say there is, I mean, this isn't, there are cuts in pollution, in air pollution and in carbon emissions globally because of lockdown and because of, industry having to stop. This isn't how I wanted to achieve it. It's good news in that sense, but this isn't how we should make that happen. And also, although the emissions right now have really dropped, this is just a couple of months in what's been years and years and years and decades since the Industrial Revolution of increased carbon emissions. So actually what's happening now is a tiny, tiny drop in the ocean. And unless we sustain, large-scale cuts, I don't think it's going to turn back the doomsday clock in any noticeable way, unless we, take action to sustain some of these cuts.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The doomsday clock, went to 100 seconds, I think, from 180 seconds in January. And basically, my understanding it has been that we need a change in fundamental governance internationally about how we cooperate better. And this global disruption, like I think COVID, one, it'll renew the respect for science in a way, because I think a lot of these things have been kind of pointed out by either medical professionals that something like this could happen and disrupt world systems, or it's for ages now being spoken of by environmentalists that our systems aren't designed to cope up with climate change and disruption that can come in the coming decades. So this kind of disruption that nobody expected even at the start of this year would definitely move the citizens and decision makers to respect science more and take that more into account in their decision making or policy making. Also, I think it calls for better international cooperation in a way, because one of the things I remember reading when the doomsday clock went to 100 seconds was there had been decreased commitment among nations to international cooperation. Like they were, narrowing down to their own fundamental policies that help them grow or bloom, and it was being done by the leading nations of the world. So uh, I think a reversal to that is definitely required, that international solidarity, international cooperation in terms of developing better roadmaps and pathways are the only ways that humanity can survive past this decade sustainably. So since this has happened so early on in this decade, I do think it might lead to, it could, I mean, obviously nobody can, it's such an uncertain world, nobody can say for sure, but it could lead to kind of better decisions, and the doomsday clock might not fall so drastically like it did from 180 seconds to 100 seconds.
One thing I guess I've worried about as well is that is our doomsday clock going to give an accurate picture? So I've seen in the USA there's actually been, well, as well as the loosening environmental protections that's been happening for a while, during the crisis, you've kind of said, well, if you can't really keep tabs on your emissions, you haven't really got the staff to measure it and to look at your pollution, oh, don't worry about it, which is sort of giving a green light to pollution, but without knowing, what effects that's having. So those things really worry me as well, that we might not even have an accurate picture at the moment of what's really happening. Because some countries are loosening protections and loosening even legal requirements to measure, what pollution is being created. So
yeah, one more thought. I think one of the other alternative, other pathways that emerges after this COVID crisis is governments supporting industries further. When this kind of goes away, it's supporting industry and corporations further to get back their profits or get back to speed, or kind of liven up the economy, and which might lead to kind of unheralded emissions spike or acceleration. And certainly it will happen in some countries where authoritarianism has already taken over their decision making. But at large, globally, that happening or not, hopefully doesn't happen, but it is a danger or a concern.
For a lot of countries, that obviously their economies is on pause as well. A lot of them will be focusing on sort of a economy first commitment. So how do you think that would affect sort of environment long term, post COVID-19?
Well, I very much hope that governments have the sense and the people will actually hold them to this, not to just go back to business as usual. Like, this is a real, it's a wake-up call that actually humans are, relatively vulnerable. We might think we're not, especially, in the richer nations, but we still are. And climate breakdown is going to make disease outbreaks like this potentially more common, and food shortages more common. So I hope it's a bit of a wake-up call and we don't just go back to business as usual. One really positive thing, I'm trying to find the positives in the world right now, that I've seen, has been a document put together by about 170 Dutch academics, which is kind of a model for a recovery plan that doesn't just pin itself on GDP and economic growth, but instead looks at kind of measures of well-being and measures of environmental sustainability, and splits the economy into those sectors that we do want to grow, so healthcare, education, green energy, against those that we really should be degrowing and shrinking if we want to have a hopeful future. So obviously the fossil fuel industries and other polluting industries. And transformations to farming and to transport and to consumption that we would need to see to go along with that. And I think their proposals for kind of bringing out a new form of economy and a new way that we measure economic success, if we can, if governments can internationally can adopt something more like that, I think actually this is a real opportunity to change things and change it to benefit people, you know, across society and across the world, rather than just the richest few in the richest countries, which is what we have at the moment.
What about you?
Yeah, I totally resonate with Claire, because for the past 6 months, actually, I've also been researching on alternative economic models, and I think the degrowth movement has been there for some years now, but it's never gotten its fair share of limelight or sane policy making as such. But I think, like I mentioned, the Dutch group, I think it got released a couple of days back, and there are some interesting news coming from both Spain and Netherlands, because degrowth movement is pretty strong with a lot of these economists in Spain, and they also come out with a degrowth plan for, I think, city of Barcelona. And I think that this is an opportunity, or one can say the time is ripe for governments and conglomeration of these governments in G7s and G20s to discuss alternative models of economies, because surely our current systems under capitalism have not supported the citizens equitably. They've definitely concentrated wealth in the top 1%, but as pandemics or climate change events might show later on in this decade, they will split wide open these class inequities. And especially, I think it is hugely concerning in countries in the global south, like India, Indonesia, those countries in Africa, where I mean, fortunately, until now, the pandemic hasn't affected as largely as it's done in Europe. But once it say does, I think it would need a rethinking of not just healthcare systems, but really the bigger monster, the economic system.
I have another question, because of course we've been talking about governmental change, but is there anything in a more individual way, more habits that we can take within the lockdown while we're self-isolating that might help this transition to a greener society after COVID-19?
I don't know, I think one thing that's really been positive for me is seeing an opinion poll in the UK by a company called Opinium, so that's how you pronounce them, that says that 48% of our population here still do think that the government should respond to the climate emergency with the same urgency as they have to the COVID pandemic. So I think that's really positive, that there is still, in spite of all of this, a public appetite for changing things and responding to climate change. In terms of what we can do individually, and well, obviously I'm very much behind kind of Extinction Rebellion's ethos. Actually, governments need to kind of lead on this, but there are things that individual people can do. So, for example, one thing that's been quite positive here is actually the local shops and the local small kind of grocery stores actually have managed to maintain good stocks, and I think I've found it much easier to maintain social distancing shopping locally than I have going to the big supermarket, where often everything has been panic bought. And I think that shows that our supply chains are, in the big stores, are too kind of just in time, last minute deliveries. Everything runs out as soon as anything happens. But also a lot of the local businesses have been much more agile and able to adapt to this crisis, and are setting up local delivery services and click and collect services where the big kind of companies haven't been able to react as quickly and to meet that demand. So I'm hoping that this means that people are kind of thinking about switching to shopping locally more. I know a lot of my neighbours are, and getting kind of veg boxes delivered from local farms. So really putting our money into kind of local supply chains and local food production. I think that's a really positive thing that comes out. And something I'm trying to do, which is more, for my mental health as much as for the environment, but is having a kind of technology-free day kind of once a week, where we're spending more and more time online, which is lovely, because otherwise I wouldn't get to meet you. But yeah, to kind of just slow things down a little bit and cut power consumption, and I found that to be quite a good thing to do personally.
Yeah, I think apart from these fundamentals around energy consumption, food, transport, and all that, I think this pause, I'm hoping, would definitely have given a lot of people to rethink how the busyness in their lives day to day needs to be replaced with more kind of mindfulness and intentionality in a way. Also, I think the hyper globalized world that we've brought on to ourselves, especially in the last 20-30 years, at least in developing nations like India, has meant that everybody is kind of aspiring to do things with multinationals or by multinational products, or yeah, just this kind of need needs to replace with more local thinking and local nurture, and kind of looking at economies not of scale necessarily, but economies that support local well-being. Because I mean, when we talk about uh, the fundamental problem with the economic system, it's very much linked to this idea of globalization and liberalization and privatization. So I think looking at local supply chains, shorter supply chains, local systems of providing the basic necessities to all people are, I think, fundamental opportunities for citizens to start looking at, slowly, and kind of including that in their personal lives. I mean, yes, most important is systemic top-down actions and roadmaps from governments, but I don't think after this pandemic and this huge pause, this huge unprecedented pause that has come onto our lives, there is enough excuse for citizens anymore to look the other way, which has been the case. I mean, when I look at a lot of my friends or look at a lot of my even family members or just general population, people have been conveniently looking the other way because there hasn't been an incentive for them to look this way. But now there is, and yeah, so I think that would be the biggest uh, thing for me that citizens can do on their own.
I know, totally. Like, I really agree with that I think people are they're being forced to kind of take time out and sit back and think about what's really most important to them. And the interesting thing is, I mean, this is my friendship group and probably a biased group of people, but no one is saying, oh, I really miss, going to the shops and buying a cheap t-shirt that I'm going to wear twice. They say, oh, I miss seeing my family, I miss seeing my friends, and I think that people are going to start realizing what's really most important to them, and maybe that will help us in this transition to consuming a little bit less, and sharing things more, sharing things with our neighbours. And there's been a lot more kind of borrowing a drill from a neighbour than than there might have been, because everyone's home and we're doing it safely, don't worry, we don't go near each other, that kind of thing. And I hope that mindset shift might help. Another thing I think has been really positive in all of this is that a couple of countries we're in the process already of conducting citizens' assemblies. So this is, if for those that don't know, this is the idea that normal people are kind of called up, a bit like a jury service for a court, to learn a bit about the environment and climate change, and then together come up with proposals that they then put to the local government or the national government about what they as people think should be done about the climate crisis. And the UK was already started on this process, admittedly on quite a small scale, but nevertheless it's a good thing that it's happening. And so was France, and that kind of got pushed aside a bit initially by the lockdown, but now they've both moved online, and they're holding their citizens' assembly meetings online. And I know that the French Citizens' Assembly has actually already put forward kind of provisional recommendations to their government, and I really hope that this is perfect timing, because this is going to hopefully influence governments in how they construct their recovery strategy to make it more sustainable and more equitable for their people, and internationally as well. So I really look forward to seeing what the people who are stuck at home in the UK taking part in the Citizens' Assembly come up with. I hope it'll influence our government.
Citizens' Assembly was one of the 5 points that Extinction Rebellion put ahead as well, right? I don't know if I'm mistaken, but
yeah, no, that's true.
Okay.
Ishan wants to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, giving the power back to the people, and I think citizen assemblies are that kind of democratic way to make the voices of people heard. Because the thing in this whole climate conversation has been that people are rising up, but the governments aren't. So how do we take this voice there and really pull in ideas and pull in the reason that we feel so strongly about these issues, and how can we start solving them, and how can the people participate in that? In India, we've been kind of talking about that too for some time, but it's not quite happened for a lot of reasons. Because here the situation is a lot more fragmented on ground, um, and I think one thing I didn't mention in this kind of COVID response thing is, and in India is going through that period, especially in the last 6 months, is this communal angle, and it's very easy for the governments and leaders to break society apart on communal angles, because there is a huge history behind that, at least in India. So citizen assemblies could be that kind of equitable way to bring together people across all classes and differentials, to really come together in solidarity first and commune to then take their issues and concerns to their local authorities. In a way, citizen assemblies have been part of the Indian fabric in a very different way, but it needs a lot more structure, not lot more connection with the governments and how this can be taken to the next level. So I definitely personally hoping to kind of execute some of these models in India this year.
I think, I mean, just to give a bit of the background of citizens' assemblies, they're a tool that's been used in places like Ireland, where there is, a very controversial and often dividing down kind of religious background lines in society, issues about abortion. And they use citizens' assemblies to actually reach some kind of consensus decision about what should happen nationally in terms of the law there. And it was really successful. And then there was a referendum on that question. And actually, it turned out that the Citizens' Assembly recommendations really matched the national referendum vote when it was finally made. So I think it showed that the Citizens' Assembly really works as a way of reaching across society and gathering together everyone's opinions and having them debate things, in a civil way, and come to some kind of agreement that everyone could get behind, at least sufficiently, to make that the law. So I'm hopeful that this is a good model for the climate. And I'd really like to see kind of recovery citizens' assemblies as well in different cities and different countries, to involve the people in thinking about, what's the best way, out of this once the immediate crisis of coronavirus is over. I think that would be a positive thing.
Speaking of conversations, of course, headlines, like what people are talking about all these days, is becoming about the pandemic. It sort of has overshadowed everything else. How do you think we could still balance off, like the conversation about the environment, about climate change, but while still, without overlapping health and safety concerns about, the pandemic? Because we are encouraged to wear masks, and medics are wearing like protection gears, but a lot of it will be inevitably become like plastical waste. How do we still discuss about not using plastic in this environment? What do you guys think?
So yeah, this is something that is actually close to my heart in a way. So I'm a waste management professional too, and one of the first things that I was discussing in my circles about a month back was how in India the waste situation and the infrastructure is itself, quite bleak, and the value chains have been easily disrupted over the last month, because with all these lockdowns and all kinds of chaos, not being sure which kind of workers are allowed and which not. There has been both a problem at the time of collection of waste from different households or corporations or buildings, and both at the processing end. So one is that the whole waste infrastructure bit, that is a cause for concern in these lockdowns, how these essential services need to be supported better by the government, but also at the consumer angle, because now in this hyper sanitized world where, and it is important maybe in this time where people just don't know what services they're touching, and hence you need to be super careful. So disposables definitely will go up a lot in this kind of interim time, which might be 2 months or 6 months or 2 years. We don't know. But at the same time, making sure that the governments don't relax on any positive work that already started on phasing out single-use plastic in the industries, because these are very easy times, and I've read a couple of reports already how certain companies who would be manufacturing plastic bags have gone to the government and said, this is important. You need your food delivered in absolute sanitized waste. You need plastic bags, not paper bags, and things of those sorts. So it's again that catch-22 situation, and you need smart people at the helm to say that yes, we need certain, say, element of disposability in our lives to make sure that the virus does not contract to more people, but at the same time not relaxing the rules in a way that industry falls back to the same things, at least in India, that were happening 2-3 years back, where there were a lot of laws, but everybody was manufacturing disposables, everybody was consuming disposables, there was no infrastructure to recycle, etc. So the waste industry, I think a lot of gains that at least they were making the last 2-3 years in India, and even largely globally in different parts, in different countries, hope they don't kind of get erased.
I mean, yeah, I agree. It's probably a part of mindset that might be going in the wrong direction. And I'm going to be the last person that says, anyone working in medicine should not use disposable protective equipment. I think our worries about plastic waste should first of all be focused on the things that we really, really don't need. We don't need plastic bottles. We don't in this country, and a lot of kind of the Western world, and we have a perfectly good water supply, and we don't need plastic bags here. You can wash a cotton bag at a high temperature, that's hygienic. More and more people are having to go, shopping in person rather than, if you're not in the high risk group, have deliveries. So we really don't, there's not really that much change in terms of those things right now. And actually locally to me, a couple of the kind of low waste shops where you take your own container or things get weighed out to you in paper bags, they're actually some of the best stocked stores at the moment for essential things like flour, and people are making, in this lockdown time, people are making more things at home. Like, I mean, it's really hard to buy baker's yeast at the moment because lots of people are making their own breads and cakes and all sorts of other things. And I think we can really think about carrying some of this over to reduce waste. Like, people are learning new skills now that will help them to make things at home that they might otherwise bought in a plastic bag, or a plastic pack. So if we can keep some of that going afterwards, then we'll have actually had a good effect on plastic waste.
I think part of the conversation initially was, people sort of going out in groups to Tesco's or supermarkets buying tissue papers. Do you guys see there might be an impact on the environment? Because obviously, toilet paper has this like origin back from like cutting out trees and all that. Like, what do you guys think about that?
Very Western problem. One of my Indian friends that I work with joked at me that there was all this panic buying of toilet paper in the UK, and he's like, well, the rest of us, we use water. Good point. Obviously that has other problems. Water doesn't come for free either in environmental terms in a lot of places. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's making people think more carefully about how much they use and being a bit more sparing with their resources, because you don't know if when you go to the shop you're going to be able to buy a toilet roll or not. I did worry about the food waste that was going to be caused with panic buying. That's calmed down a little bit here in the UK, but there must have been a lot of food that people kind of bought in a panic, probably wrapped in plastic, and it went straight into the bin 2 weeks later because they hadn't used it. So maybe now people are kind of calming down and starting to think about what they really actually need and use things a bit more sparingly, and that could be a good thing in the long term.
So, Ishan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah.
Best toilet paper substitute for me.
So I think that, this is something that is probably the funniest thing for me, that all the disruptions that we're seeing because of this. Toilet paper buying was obviously one of the biggest alarming things. Supermarkets running out of it, people wanting to hoard them. I know a Canadian who went from Oroville here 10 days back, and he took back 10 toilet paper rolls because his mom called him saying that there's none available in Canada. So, I mean, that these incidences tell me that, the West has taken so much from the East, meditation, yoga, spirituality, and all that. I think there's one thing that you need to take. You need to use water instead of tissue paper. I mean, I don't mean to shame anybody, but I think using tissue paper, which obviously uses a lot of water to manufacture too, in terms of environmental terms, is obviously a lot more, kind of, resource heavy compared to just using simple water. So yeah, I mean, it's a different thing. Hygiene cannot be instructed by somebody else that this is how you need to definitely do it. But I think there is some scope there for unlearning and relearning.
I'm gonna try. I'll let you know.
Yeah, I think it was kind of like a culture shock for me. This is my personal experience, but in Spain we do have bidets, so
Yeah.
it was kind of like weird for me to go into the UK without any of that, and it was like, okay, I mean, it's not very used now, but it is something that you have there and you can use if you want to. So it was kind of a cultural shock for me to go into a bathroom without a bidet. I don't know.
Yeah.
But moving a little bit away, I don't know, Jerry, if you have some questions about this topic, or should I just move
So
into the next?
I think we can sort of go to the next topic we want to discuss. So it's about activism. So obviously the world is in lockdown, but how about the activists? Like how do you guys are doing? How do activist groups? How are activist groups doing during the lockdown? Especially Extinction Rebellion, who are known for their activities. How has this transition been for you guys and the group at large, of course?
So I think in India, for the last 3 months, since mid-Jan, we've actually been on a pause already, because we had identified a lot of methods that or tactics that we were kind of thinking of deploying in India weren't working in a way. I mean, you were having these climate strikes and kind of show of support, getting more people together and all that, but fundamentally it wasn't shifting. And personally, I think it was a lot driven by me too, that I think we need more kind of long-term thinking in that sense. So when this disruption happened, uh, I think in our circles we heard a lot of changes of plans happening for a lot of other XR national movements, but not so for XR India, because we'd already been on a pause and we weren't really thinking about this rebellion in April, May, which was planned globally by XR for different countries at different times. So a lot of pivoting has very organically happened from on-ground kind of mobilizing and movement to creating these online circles. So there are webinars happening on different things. Like yesterday itself, there were about 3 different webinars on regenerative cultures. That is essentially about how people can come in solidarity and support each other's mental well-being, and kind of discuss how we can envision a more holistic future. So I think a lot of pivoting has happened very organically to do stuff online. And at the same time, given that incentive to take a longer pause to see how, in a post-COVID world, climate activism will work. Because the attitude of governments and decision makers might have changed, the attitude of citizens might have changed, uh, and yeah, just that has been, I think, interesting. Personally, though, I'm more looking forward to, I think, the next month, because a lot of actors in India, at least, were kind of playing around with their own personal capacities to how their lives are more restricted and constricted, and as people get more kind of comfortable almost with the idea of a lockdown in India, I think we'll be able to mobilize more online strikes or online conversations.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I feel that it's been quite a challenge actually, because on the one hand, we really have such very little time, as the doomsday clock shows, left to do something about, the climate emergency, that you kind of don't want to lose that time because of another crisis. But at the same time, I really want to show compassion for everyone who's going through this like immediate crisis right now and who are losing, loved ones. And have enough to worry about. There's a high level of anxiety anyway, so it's getting that balance right between talking about the longer term climate issue and in the current situation. I found that a very delicate balance to tread, and I think that there are a lot of similarities. I'd like to see more discussion about how, climate breakdown is likely to bring more frequent or more severe disease outbreaks in future. And obviously some of the issues that, frankly, a lot of richer people in the West are experiencing. I wouldn't even call it food insecurity, but, not always having everything they ever want when they go to the shops. Those of us who are well off here. And kind of making that link of, okay, well, this is actually what this is going to mean for our food supplies. So trying to take this as a learning kind of experience collectively for what this might mean in the future. One thing that's been sad is, well, initially I was quite frustrated about it, that the COP26 international climate talks are going to be postponed, and that was a real focus. That was going to happen in the UK this year. In the autumn, and that was a real focus of kind of momentum and for activism around that, and that's obviously been postponed. And I was initially quite disappointed and frustrated about that, and the fact that what this is going to mean for our really quite short timelines that we need to act on. But actually I'm feeling a bit more positive about that as well now, that actually that means that the third of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the next instalment of their report, is going to be out before that next meeting happens now, which I think is a really important piece of work, piece of information for government leaders to be aware of when they're making those decisions. And maybe some of the international cooperation that's coming out of this will really help those international negotiations, and there'll be like we've been talking about, there'll be a real opportunity to kind of rethink society and the economy. So I'm trying to remain optimistic about that, and when that does happen, I'm pretty sure activists will be busy working around that, trying to put public focus onto those leaders making decision. And I guess on a more personal level, I know for a lot of activists that I'm involved with, both in Extinction Rebellion and campaigners in the Green Party, we got quite a long way with plans for what activism was going to take in the May rebellion, and there was meant to be a local election in the UK as well in May, which has been postponed for a year. So on a personal level, it was really hard to kind of let go of all the hard work and preparations that have been put in for that. But I think that's one thing that Extinction Rebellion are good at. Like we're often sort of given the message that we need to psychologically focus on our involvement and what we do, and not on the outcomes, because we don't have control of the outcomes. And I guess that's been a good psychological lesson during lockdown as well, that you can only focus on your behaviour and your involvement, and you have to try to let go a little bit psychologically of what the ultimate things outside of your control really are. And we've got a really good community, so there's been a lot of activists supporting each other on a personal level and making sure that everyone's got what they need and has some social interaction, even if it is on Zoom. So yeah, it's been positive to be involved in those groups, even though we're kind of a little bit on pause at the moment.
So Ishan, you did talk and mentioned permanent changes on the activism and the type of way we try to fight against the environment. What other things do you think are going to permanently change, or at least affect the way we do things?
You mean generally, like in a city or a country, or you mean more in the activist circles, what things are going to permanently change?
Both are actually good.
So I mean, these are very uncertain times, and I'm no kind of prophet, but I think definitely the way a lot of people, for example, business travel, I think for every small thing I saw, my colleagues, not exactly colleagues, but my say friends or people I knew, flying between places to do simple deals or simple conversations, simple meetings. And I think that will permanently change. People will be a lot more mindful of traveling from point A to point B for just bizarre meetings maybe, and doing them either online or in person with other people in the same city or place. So I think that kind of unnecessary travel, which had kind of been exponentially growing almost with falling airline prices and better jobs and more privilege, I think that will not be taken for granted anymore. People will, so I think the tourism industry at large and the travel industry at large will face lot long-term disruptions, and most other industry in that sense. So I think that could be a permanent shift. Uh, Apart from that, I think it depends a lot on different countries on how they respond. If we find countries going narrower and more internal, and developing more authoritarian ways of kind of tracking citizens for surveilling and cutting out um, um, your international companies, then it could change the way we consume. It could change the way we look at brands. It could change the way we might see a lot more kind of locally based brands being part of our lives. Yeah, I think yes, some of these disruptions could be interesting. They shouldn't come from xenophobic themes, because that can very well happen, because it's already happening. How coronavirus is blamed on China, and I remember seeing some really bad posts in Indian circles too, on how they're saying we're not we're going to teach China a lesson by not buying brands like Xiaomi and all these things. And it might be good to localize, but not through these themes or through these directions. It has to be done in ways of cutting down supply chains, and how it's going to be important for local livelihoods or the environment. So I think these are very kind of dicey things, the routes that countries might take to manifest decisions. Yeah, and while in activist circles, I think this, like I said, in India, it already been taking place, and largely, personally, I felt, even with Extinction Rebellion, I think, for example, the October Rebellion wasn't that resonating a thing like the April Rebellion was last year. And that was, I think, that there needs to be re-envisioning of what a future world looks like. It needs to re-envision how this is not just an environment movement, but a global justice movement. And I think with this pandemic coming into the mix, and we understanding how our systems are failing, and hence the activists were correct, but how can we tap into more smartly these systemic errors? How the inequalities in healthcare and welfare, racial inequalities, to how we've seen the black and brown people a lot more affected by the crisis in the Western world. So, I mean, these are things to, I think, tap into for the activists, and use them in messaging more kind of smartly and more deep rootedly. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, I've been really sad as well to see how initially, there was kind of a rise in racist remarks, racist behaviour towards, people who looked like they might be of, Asian descent, because of, where we think this virus originated from. And I just think that's really narrow-minded, because, I mean, obviously racism is always quite narrow-minded, but this could have happened anywhere. And there's an outbreak of a swine flu in Poland that's happened recently, and I think, that's a wake-up call, not to kind of shame or target individual countries, but to think about all of us and our relationship with how we produce food and where we get our food from, and how we conserve the natural world. So yeah, and also a positive opportunity. Like, a lot of my friends are learning new vegetarian recipes while they're in lockdown, so it's a new chance to kind of think about how we produce our food more sustainably and more safely in terms of human health and human and local distribution. Yeah, you mentioned public transport, I think, didn't you? So yeah, obviously I'm a bit concerned that people are going to be frightened to go back to public transport. At least in the UK, our people who are working in healthcare have been basically banned from using public transport to get to work at the moment, because of the infection risk to them mostly. But there has been a big rise in people walking, running, cycling. What I would like to see here, and the government has actually increased the powers of local government to make this happen just recently, is more road space being given over to people who are walking and cycling for their exercise, or because they're key workers getting to work. And with temporary changes to the road layout, and kind of more pedestrianisation and lowering the speed limits. And And I wonder if that will help. I mean, not only now people keep their distance from other people when they are actually, making those essential journeys, but also help people getting to work to stay safe, but also like help people to make that shift and maybe stick to it. We've got just about the right amount of time, or possibly more, in lockdown to start developing new habits. So if we all get used to, get more confident at riding our bikes in a safer environment, then maybe some of that will stick. Yeah, and I really hope, public transport will be invested in and as part of the recovery program as well. And
if I could come in there again, I think I lost one thing, which obviously Claire, I think, mentioned a bit, the animal agriculture industry, I think, and that is something that needs to be kind of in focus now, because there have been obviously a lot of movement in the animal activism space, and there've been calls for a lot more policy level changes with respect to that industry, but it's not quite happened. And I think with this, unprecedented epidemic all over the world, which in a way results from animal exploitation, uh, that industry should see permanent kind of disruption or downfall, if I may. And I think just the idea of how we get our food and how we interact with the natural world, that should be one thing that people should rally around more. And also the decision makers should curtail the powers of the industry and basically crack down on factory farms. I mean, I'm in a way animal activist myself, and I think that is one of the things that I definitely feel the citizens should rally around more, because it's ultimately talking about, if you're talking about protecting animals, you're now directly protecting your children, you're directly protecting your communities, you're directly protecting your cities, you're directly protecting your livelihoods, and that connection has to be made now. I mean, the time hasn't been riper than now.
one thing that's interesting now actually is even in the urban area in the UK where I live, which is not particularly biodiverse, people are seeing a lot more wildlife. There's a lot more birds kind of making themselves visible in the gardens, and people are, I guess, having the time and being at home to pay attention to that. And I wonder if that's going to kind of shift our collective like baseline of what we think nature should look like. And it's still a long way from, what it once did look like, especially, here. But make people more aware of actually, the fact of how impoverished our natural world has become, and how actually, people are saying here, oh, I can hear the birds singing every morning, whereas normally you can only hear traffic. And I know this has been repeated, kind of in cities across Europe, people having these experiences. And there have been goats running through, wild goats running through the centre of villages in Wales, and there have been like wild boars coming out into the city in Spain and things. And I wonder if that's going to sort of change people's perspective on what they think is normal and what they think kind of should be, possibly in a good way. We'll see.
Yeah.
It's definitely very like sort of healing for all of us, seeing animals, sort of having more of a space these days. I think there was a report, I think from yesterday, about the lions sort of lying on the road, and
in South Africa.
South Africa, yeah.
Wow. What's your best spot? What have you seen that you've not seen very often before? Have you seen anything out of the window?
I've seen some monkeys nearby my house. They're like, yeah, they're the local, like they had taken back their turfs basically, because we have mountains nearby my house, and that's just like, wow, that opened my, and squirrels, and I sort of loved it because I'd never seen them before being this active. And I think that has something to do with, the lack of people, not the lack of people, the decrease of people going out and everything.
Yeah, and traffic as well, I guess. Yeah.
So one more thing about animals I want to bring up was there has been discussions about the origins of the virus being from wet markets. So also obviously we can see a correlation between sort of how we sort of use animals as resources and the spread of pandemics. What do you guys expect, like what governments could do in the future to sort of restrict these kind of things from happening again? Ishan?
Like I said, the crackdown on the animal agriculture industry is obviously key. Wet markets have existed all around the world. It's not only in China. Maybe the density of them and the way they conducted them might have been different, but yeah, even in India there were wet markets. So I think the need is for systematically the focus moving away from these exotic like wildlife markets, or moving away from selling animals by and large. For them to incentivize people moving away from selling of these exotic animals and wild animals as such in the markets, and moving people towards sustainable food and sustainable farming initiatives, and basically disincentivizing or cutting down funding of any of these corporations, because animal farming is not good for the planet, as it's been seen this time.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I do think trade in wild animals for food or for anything or for medicine or anything, and should be banned. And wet markets have a huge animal welfare as well as a biodiversity negative effect. But we do need to look at people's cultural traditions and people's where they get their protein from as well. It's no good kind of me sitting here saying, well, let's ban someone's food source. Bush meat has been an important source of food for people who live in poorer, remote places and don't have enough protein. So I guess it's looking at distribution of food, and there's a lot of places where local crops are basically grown for a market thousands of miles away and not to feed, reliant on wild animals. So I think that's something we really need to redress, the kind of the sharing out of food and farming space, and particularly in the light of upcoming further droughts and fires and extreme weather from climate change. That's going to put more pressure on land use. So yeah, the quicker we can start to redress that now, the less likely we are to run into famine events and future pandemics coming from those sources. So.
There has been reports about now China has managed to contain the pandemic a bit better. Their pollution rates has gone back to normal. Now their lockdown has ended. Do you see like a similar thing happening in Western nations once the pandemic's over?
Probably. Being realistic, I know there's a lot of power is held or manipulated by the very rich, and the very rich got to be very rich with a lot of fossil fuels and airlines and polluting industries, and they're going to be putting huge pressure on the decision makers right now to make sure that things do go back to normal as quickly as possible, or more than normal. And I guess it's the role of us as citizens and as activists to try to put pressure on government to say, well, that's not what we want, that's not in our interest, and to try and redress this balance between, well, who is the economy really serving? Is it serving the well-being of normal people, or is it serving the super rich? And I hope that this is an opportunity to really try to make some of these changes and develop a more sustainable and fair and compassionate economy. But I guess we'll see in the UK and a lot of other countries at the moment in the West, we've probably got the wrong governments, the worst possible governments in charge at the moment for this situation. So yeah, I'll be doing my best and I know other activists will as well, to make that happen.
Yeah. What are the the sort of like the conversation going between activists and scientists about what kind of regulations or sort of things people should be campaigning about after the COVID-19 pandemic has ended? Like, is there sort of a direction people like the scientists and activists wants the government to do after this whole crisis come down?
Yeah, I mean, I know, scientists have been saying this for a long time. I think, the pandemic has kind of shown, or at least in my country, how important it is to listen to scientists, but how also government can be quite slow to do so, which is kind of a micro version of what's happening, you know, on a larger scale with climate breakdown. That, you know, and I think as scientists, as a scientist, I think sometimes the way that we speak and the kind of ifs and buts and the, oh, we're not quite sure, and the uncertainty that as a scientist, when you're talking to other scientists, you have to put in, can be taken as either, well, if I'm being generous, misunderstood by politicians, and if I'm being less generous, kind of ignored and used by politicians as a kind of get out clause to actually take the action that they really, really should, in terms of saving lives and protecting the environment. So yeah, perhaps what we need is scientists and activists to have and journalists, and to have a really good conversation about how to communicate this really important message to the government and to the population. And I guess one thing we've seen here in the lockdown is we have some really safe, really short, simple messages, you know, stay home, stay safe, save lives. And they're all really short and simple. And I guess that seems to be really creating the social change in terms of behaviour change and spreading infection. I actually think there's another kind of reason for hope there as well. I'm trying. So obviously, you know, locking down and cutting all the industry has caused a huge dent in the economy, at least temporarily. And I think that just shows like what governments can choose to do and what people will accept when they really see the urgency and the importance of this and that lives are at stake. So I think the argument now that, oh, well, we just can't afford it and we just can't change when it comes to climate has been shown to be false. Like if we're serious about something, we can change it. And the good news, I guess, there is that you know, things like the Green New Deal, that's a kind of transition to a more sustainable economy and energy generation that's been proposed by opposition parties in the UK, it would cost something like, you know, just 1.5% of our GDP over the next 10 years. And actually, on a month-by-month basis, that's so low in comparison to the hit that this crisis is going to put on the economy. So no, if people think, oh, well, it's going to be awful, you know, trying to do something about the environment, it's going to cause such a hit to, you know, our standard of living. Maybe this shows that really it's not, that actually what we need to do on the environment is really good value for money in a way, because it would cost a drop of what we're currently sacrificing to deal with Corona in the short term. But it would have you know, a much bigger effect in terms of saving lives down the line in the future, and even now in some places. So yeah, I think it's a good lesson to us that actually we can afford to do these, and we can do the behaviour change, and actually we can repurpose industry. You know, there's been car manufacturers who've shut down car production and switched to making ventilators in a really short space of time. So if we want to, and if the political will is there, we can switch from, you know, producing polluting unnecessary goods to producing things that are, you know, for the sustainable energy production and things really, really quickly. We just, you know, need to see that and push our leaders to make that happen.
So just to wrap up everything, sort of, so what are your hopes for the future? You know, what are your best wishes? What do you guys want to happen in the future? I get Ishan, want to go first?
I think the focus of the policymakers a lot of time has been just economy, and how do we kind of sustain that, grow that, make our industries grow faster, be competitive with other countries, and kind of beat them. I think the narrative has to definitely shift from that to looking at how in this post-COVID world where disruptions to our how can we trust science more, and how can we use more of a decision centered around scientific thinking, both in terms of how we solve the pollution, how we solve the climate change problems, how we make sure that we restore our environments, and also at the same time looking at how we propel this local human capital into activities and industries which help support the communities better. If we're going to incentivize multinationals and have sweatshops, have garment workers in small shanties in Bangladesh, kind of working for these multinationals who sell a lot of things in Europe and abroad. It's really not supporting sustainably. It's in fact giving them a lot of undignified work. So I think this is an opportunity for decision makers and all the top down structures to realign, and that is my biggest hope. Also, I think uh, the aspirations of an individual, how we look at living our lives, how we look at our future, might change, and I think that can only be for the better now. It won't be for the worse. Uh, so I think these are my two biggest hopes, maybe.
Well, I guess for me on a personal level, I'm really looking forward to being able to hug my friends and my family again, and even get in the same city as some of them, and to meet some of the new people on a local community level who I've been coordinating with to kind of organise shopping and actually meet them face to face. That would be really nice. And I suppose that carries over to what I want for the wider world. I hope that we will learn from this, that we need to respect life over money, and to prioritize the things that really matter, and to give thanks and fair pay and decent working conditions to the people that are actually making our world tick, which are at the moment the healthcare people, the people who work in food production and distribution, who often we kind of neglect and put in low paid jobs, and rather than the kind of focus on rich bankers and for an ever growing economy that doesn't really benefit most people in our society. So I really hope to see this mindset shift, which will also trickle into our leaders. As was mentioned earlier, our Prime Minister has recovered from COVID, and I hope that will be a lesson to him, to think about some of this stuff and think about the priority of healthcare and carers and food production in our country.
How about you, Alex? What do you want to see happening after everything's done?
I was not expecting that question, to be honest, but I guess something along what Clare and Ishan has said, just for people to be more grateful and conscious of what they have, and learn to prioritize what they should be prioritizing, focusing more on the future than on their present selves, if that makes any sense, that they don't only have to take care of themselves, but also look out for those who are coming in the next generations. Yeah. What about you, Jerry?
For me, I think I agree with everybody, what everybody just said. I think it's really good that hopefully this will shift focus for everybody to sort of look more into the future. This missing argument for climate change are, it's not very immediate, it's not there yet, so we don't need to deal with this. And I hope this crisis will help us, because 2 months ago, a lot of governments and a lot of people are sort of dismissing this pandemic as well, saying it's a hoax, saying it's not real. And I hope this will, sort of clarify some of the things, make people sort of, like you said, reevaluate some of their priorities. And that's what I want our podcast to achieve as well, sort of inform people, but also sort of give people some hope. And that's why a lot of topics in this podcast has been about the future instead of just now, because I think we do need to think about the world beyond the current pandemic, the post-COVID-19 world, regenerating world, hopefully. So with this note, I want to thank everybody here. This has been a very vivid, interesting conversation. I'm grateful for everybody expressing their opinions and sort of providing some of the thoughts you had. For me, I'll be signing off from Taipei. My local time is 47 p.m. How about you, Claire?
Signing off from Newcastle. It's about lunchtime. It's nearly 2 p.m. in the afternoon.
How about you, Ishan?
Yeah, it's 6:47, 6:17 here, and yeah, this was a really fun conversation, I think, and a lot of things to share from different parts of the world. So really great for that, and thank you for being patient with my really awesome internet.
How about you, Alex?
Yeah, I'm signing up from Madrid, and it's currently 2:48, so lunchtime as well.
So to contact us, Alex, do you want to tell them about our email address or join into the conversation? What we're doing?
Yeah. So we have an email that it's quarantk, that's QURANTK@gmail.com. And we also have a Twitter, which is quarantine_talk. So you can find us and DM us or email us, whatever you prefer. Whether it is to be part of a podcast or because you have an interesting story that you want to share in our blog, we're open for everyone to participate with us.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
So thank you.
Thank you so much to you guys, too.
So, Jerry, thanks for Alex.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.